Thank you very much, Henrietta. Thank you all. Before I begin my prepared comments, I want to say honestly, it's a great honor for me to be here and to be part of this conference. I want to really thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me to be part of this. It's inspiring to say the least, and I really, as a sort of a life moment, this is great stuff. So thank you. I've worked a lot in Scandinavia over the past 5 years or so with Men for Gender Equality and other women and men in Sweden and elsewhere who have brought me over, and I wouldn't probably be here were it not for their advocacy and leadership, so I thank them as well. I also want to say that I'm part of a growing movement of men in the North America and Europe and all over the world, really, in a multicultural, multi-ethnic sense, a growing movement of men who are finally beginning to take women's leadership ideas and moral lesson, if you will, and going into parts of male culture that have historically been either apathetic about or openly hostile to women's efforts to engage them. We're going into parts of male culture, the sports culture, the military cultures, in schools and in other bastions of male power, and talking about men's violence and challenging other men to start standing up and speaking out with women as our friends and our partners and our allies, not as our antagonists in somehow this fictional battle between the sexes that so many people understand these issues to be. And part of my work is to break down that artificial nature of this as women against men or men against women. We live in the world together. Our lives are inextricably interwoven. Every issue that affects women affects men by definition, as does every issue that affects men affects women by definition. And by the way, I just used the gender binary. I understand there's more people in the world than men and women. It's a more expansive gender binary than the gender binary. But I'm going to say, to begin my prepared remarks, that we need a paradigm shift in our thinking and our understanding about the issues of gender violence. When I say gender violence, I'm talking about sexual assault, domestic violence, sexual harassment, the sexual abuse of children, that whole range of issues that I'll refer to in shorthand as gender violence issues. They've been seen as women's issues that some good men help out with, but I'm here to say that I don't accept that frame. I don't see these issues in that way. I don't see these as women's issues that some good men help out with. In fact, I'm going to argue that these are men's issues, first and foremost. And if we have any hope of dramatically reducing the levels of violence perpetrated by men against women and children and other men in the world, if we have any hope of doing that, we have to have this paradigm shift and see it centrally as about men and men's engagement and men's leadership, which I'll get to in a few moments. Now, having said that, let me say, men's leadership is building on women's leadership. I'm not saying that men need to take over from women. No one that I know and the people with whom I work thinks that or believes that or acts on that. It's not about taking over from women. It's about shifting the burden of responsibility onto the shoulders where it should be, which is on the men who are in power and the men who are committing the acts of violence. Calling domestic and sexual violence a women's issue is another form of victim blaming. It's putting it on the shoulders of the victims to respond. It's putting on the shoulders of the victims to organize, to agitate, to politicize, and that's not fair, to say the least, is it? So this paradigm shift is fundamental to what we need to do going forward. By the way, the term gender, people hear the word gender, right? A lot of people think that the word gender means women. So anytime you have a conversation where gender is in the title, and it's not a mandatory event, in other words, you hope people will show up. If the word gender is in the title, who shows up? It's overwhelmingly women. Most people see gender issues as synonymous with women's issues. There's some confusion about the term gender, and let me illustrate that confusion by way of analogy, okay? So let's talk for a moment about race. And I'm going to use the United States, my home, as the reference point, but you can plug in Scandinavian analogs, right? So let's talk about race for a moment. In the US, when people hear the word race, they tend to think it means African American, Latino, Asian American, Native American, South Asian, Pacific Islander. Or when people hear the word sexual orientation, they tend to think it means gay, lesbian, bisexual. And when people hear the word gender, they tend to think it means women. In each case, the dominant group doesn't get paid attention to. As if white people don't have some sort of racial identity or belong to some racial category or construct. As if heterosexual people don't have a sexual orientation. As if men don't have a gender. This is one of the ways that dominant systems maintain and reproduce themselves. which is to say the dominant group is rarely challenged to even think about its dominance, because that's one of the key characteristics of power and privilege, the ability to go unexamined, lacking introspection or self-awareness. In fact, being rendered invisible in parts of the discourse about issues that are often centrally about us. And it's amazing how this works in domestic and sexual violence, how men have been so often erased from the very conversation. I'll give you a handful of examples of what I'm talking about. You'll hear people ask questions like, how many women in Sweden were raped last year? Not how many men raped women. Or you'll hear people say, how many girls in the Malmo school district were harassed or abused last year? Not how many boys harassed or abused girls. Or how many girls harassed or abused girls. You'll hear people say things like in Denmark, how many teenage girls got pregnant last year, not how many men and boys impregnated teenage girls. In each case, the use of the passive voice has a very powerful political effect. The political effect is the shift in focus off of the dominant group and onto the subordinated group. And that's not a coincidence or an accident. It's not sloppy use of language. It's how power functions, in this case through invisibility and stealth. And so part of our challenge, those of us who are trying to shift the paradigm, is to make visible what has been rendered invisible. And that's uphill. It's an uphill challenge. Even the term violence against women is problematic. You never hear me say the term violence against women. What's missing? The active agent is missing. It's just a bad thing that happens to women, violence against them. But if you insert the active agent, men, you have a new phrase, men's violence against women. It doesn't roll off the tongue as easily, but it's more accurate and it's more honest, isn't it? Now, by the way, the old paradigm plays out all the time in the mainstream media conversation about these issues. So for example, at the Video Music Awards last year when Miley Cyrus and Robin Thicke were performing, so much of the conversation after that performance was about Miley Cyrus and how she might be a bad role model for girls or something. Very little discussion about Robin Thicke, who produced and wrote and starred in Blurred Lines. Right? Very little discussion about Robin Thicke. Is he a good role model for boys or girls? But the discussion was focused on Miley Cyrus. That's the old paradigm, right? The old paradigm is to talk about trafficked women and children rather than the men who buy sex. You turn it around. Instead of focusing on the victims all the time, focusing on the perpetrators. If we have any hope of transforming the culture that produces victimization, this is what we need to do. I mean, we need to take care of victims and survivors. We need resources and we need, support. But that's not the same as the cultural transformation that will prevent the victimization in the first place. And for that, we need the paradigm shift. Now, some of you might be paying attention to the news that comes out of the United States on a regular basis of school shootings and rampage killings, which happen all the time in my country. Right? Well, you know what the mainstream conversation about school shootings and rampage killings is in the United States? It's about kids killing kids. It's about what's going on with our young people, what's going on with youth. It's very rare that you see a gender-specific conversation about school shootings, which are overwhelmingly perpetrated by young men and boys, right? Can you imagine if girls committed 99% of school shootings? Anybody talking about kids killing kids? The first thing they would be talking about would be, what's going on with girls? And what is it about cultural ideologies of femininity that are leading some, a small percentage, a tiny percentage, but some who are giving us an indication of what's going on in a larger sense? That would be the first thing people would be talking about. But because it's boys and men, we degender it and talk about kids and young people. And we don't get anywhere in terms of coming up with both understanding of the causes and then what to do about it. In the last couple of years, what's emerged in the conversation in the States about school shootings and rampage killings is that it's about guns and mental illness. Those are the two issues that come up over and over again. We live in a culture awash in guns, and we have a lot of mentally ill people and not enough good services. Well, guess what? Almost nobody thinks to ask in the mainstream conversation, if it's about guns and mental illness, then why don't girls and women commit 50% of the shootings? Because it's not about guns and mental illness. It's about gender, first and foremost, as it intersects with guns in some cases and mental illness in others. But if we don't talk about gender honestly, if we don't use the M word and talk about men, and masculinities, we're not going to get anywhere. Now, is it anti-male to say any of this? I completely reject that idea, that it's anti-male to say anything that I've said or anything that I've really heard today, that the idea that it's anti-male offends me. Is telling the truth anti-male? Is being honest discriminating against men? I don't think so. And let me also say, the same system that produces men who abuse women produces men who abuse other men. You know how many men are the victims of violence? You know how many men are the victims of other men's violence? Whether it's murder, attempted murder, assault, aggravated assault, gay bashing, bullying, men are the primary victims of all these crimes as well as the primary perpetrators. And look at all the boys who have been traumatized by what adult men have done to their mothers and sometimes to themselves. Look at all the boys. Look at all the young men and boys across class, race, ethnicity, all over the world who have been traumatized by adult men's violence. Is it anti-male to call out adult men's violence and its contribution to these traumatized boys? I don't think so. In fact, I think it's an act of solidarity with young men and boys. And when I hear feminists criticized as anti-male, it is infuriating for me as a man and for a lot of other men as well as for women, because it's factually incorrect and morally bankrupt to call the feminists who are standing up for justice, equality, and nonviolence, calling them bashers and man-haters, is just, to me, it's beyond the pale. Now, let me say, I know a lot of the women in this room have been called some of these names that feminists get called, right? Male basher, ball buster, feminazi. You have your own cultural and linguistic variations, right? And I bet you a lot of women in this room have been called these names. You know what that's called? It's called kill the messenger, right? It's a time-honored tradition. When people are threatened by the message, they kill the messenger, because if you write off the person presenting the ideas, then you don't have to engage with those ideas. That's one of the reasons why the term feminist has been so demonized by so many, because feminist ideas are challenging to traditional authoritarian political, economic, and social structures. And so, of course, you have to try to demonize the people who are making those arguments if you want to maintain the status quo. Now, I appreciate that women get called these names, and that in spite of these names, and in spite of some of the pushback that feminists have gotten over the centuries, there's still all of you right here, and all of us in the greater world, and there's a lot of women who have refused to be silenced, which is a great thing. In fact, the feminist movement is one of the great movements in the history of our species, bar none. One of the great historical innovations of our species. But when men like myself speak out, we get some pushback too. I'm not going to lie to you. It's not all wine and chocolates, you know, for men like me. I'm not going to equate what men like me get in terms of the backlash to what women get, but I have to say there is backlash. And let me say, before I tell you what some of that backlash is towards men like myself, my experience in working with men, my colleagues' experience in working with men in multicultural, multiracial settings, including in sports arenas like we're in right now. I've been working in the heart of male culture for 25 years, in the military, in the sports culture, and other places. Most men, once they walk through the door, getting them through the door is the key, but once they walk through the door and hear and engage, don't get all hostile and aggressive against the kind of things that I've been saying. I'm just telling you my personal experience and my colleagues. Lots of men are ready to hear what I've been saying. Lots of men. And so when I'm about to characterize a small percentage of men, please don't think that I'm implying that all men can't handle this conversation, because it's not true. But there are some men who can't handle this conversation. So I'll just give you a handful of examples of the things that I've been called, because I think it makes a larger point. I'm routinely referred to as a mangina. You heard that one? Mangina. I'm routinely referred to as a beta male as opposed to an alpha male. So think about this. Some guy in the basement of his parents' home eating Cheetos and typing on his computer keyboard, calling me a beta male. I was recently referred to as Dr. Katz straighted. And I give that person high marks for creativity, if nothing else. But you notice a theme developing here. The theme is that I'm like a woman, men like myself and other pro-feminist men are like women, therefore we don't have to listen to them in the same way the traditional patriarchal mindset has marginalized women's voices and women's ideas. We don't have to listen to them because they're women. Well, these guys are like women, therefore we don't have to listen to them. And more specifically, we don't have to listen to guys like me because I'm not a real man. I'm not a real man, so why would I have to listen to this, why would we have to listen to this guy? He's not a real man. Now, happily, I'm a middle-aged guy. It's one of the few benefits of being a middle-aged person. But I don't care what some guy in his typing at his keyboard in the basement of his parents' house is calling me on the internet. I don't care. I'm going to keep doing it. But guess what? A lot of men do care, and a lot of young men do care about what other guys think of them. And so what ends up happening is a lot of young men and men are policed into conformity with toxic ideas and ideologies of manhood because they're afraid that if they speak up, if they stand with women on issues like pornography, on issues like prostitution, on just basic issues of gender justice, that some other men will think that somehow they've gone soft, or they're not one of the guys, or they're a traitor to the home team, or whatever it is. And a lot of guys say, you know what? It's not worth it. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to take this risk. And so a lot of guys remain silent. And that's very sad, but it's one of the reasons why we need a whole lot more men, especially men with cultural, political, and social platforms, to start standing up and speaking out and say this stuff loudly, because young men and other men need to hear men saying these things. And then young boys need to hear adult men saying that we stand with women, not against them. And then boys need to hear men say that emphatically, not just in private, quietly, but from the public stage as well as in private relationships. Now, when I say we need a paradigm shift, and we have to understand these issues as men's issues, we also need to see these as leadership issues for men. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if you're a man and you're a leader in Swedish and Norwegian and Danish society and Icelandic society, anywhere really, if you're a man in your position of leadership, cultural, political, religious, business community, labor community, by definition of that leadership, you need to stand up and speak out and figure out how you can use your platform of influence to create a climate where abusive behavior, sexist abuse, heterosexist abuse is unacceptable, not because you're a nice guy helping out the women, but because you're a leader, and we expect that of our leaders. And we haven't gotten to that place yet. We haven't gotten to that place yet. People ask me, what would I do if I had the power on a university campus or in various communities, and what would I do to change the cultural climate around sexism and men's violence against women? And I say, you know what? One of the first things that I would do is I would gather up the most powerful and influential men in that organization, in that institution, in that community, and have a training for those men. Because a lot of men who make decisions, have power and make decisions about what happens in institutions and in communities, have very little training, very little insight, very little understanding about all these issues. And yet women, who often have much more knowledge, but not as much institutional power or cultural authority, get frustrated because they can't make the transformations that have to happen. And so when I'm saying that we need to engage men in this, it's not because men are the saviors who need to ride in. It's because men have power, and that power needs to be used in a constructive way. And if men in a democratic society have institutional leadership that we authorize them to have, and they're not addressing these issues, then they're not being good leaders, and we have to figure out how to pressure them and or replace them. Because if these are priorities, they're priorities. I'm going to leave you with a quote from a famous American, Frederick Douglass, who was born a slave. He became an advisor to President Lincoln, and he was also a prominent 19th century supporter of women's rights. Frederick Douglass said, "It's much easier to build healthy children than to repair broken men. It's much easier to build healthy children than to repair broken men." Well, as an educator, as a father of a son, as an activist, we need more men in the educational space, men and women working together on this, in creating educational initiatives for kids at all levels, age appropriate, where boys and girls, men and women have an opportunity to have dialogue about all of this, have thoughtful conversations about all of it, learn from each other, and move forward. Nothing less, nothing less. This level of education should be at every school in Scandinavia and throughout the world. Every member of parliament should be trained in this. Every professional and every sports culture and every sports organization should have training in all of this. These are the beginnings of the cultural transformation that have to happen over the next number of years. And men and women have to be working together to make all that happen. Thank you.